They said women didn't belong on the team, so they decided to prove it the hard way. They shoved her into a pen with 3 underfed Malinois and waited for the outcome. Staff Sergeant Mara Hale slammed into the ground, grit and blood filling her mouth, as 6 Navy SEALs laughed and rattled the chain-link gate closed behind her. In the dim light, 120 pounds of muscle, teeth and instinct circled in tight arcs, growls rolling low, hackles standing stiff. The biggest male snapped forward, teeth flashing. What those operators didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the small tattoo hidden under her sleeve carried a history that would have made every one of them stop and ask her name before trying to break her. The dogs saw something the men refused to notice, and in less than half a minute, everything those men believed about weakness was about to fall apart. At 0530 hours, Port Reyes Naval Amphibious Base sat buried under a heavy marine layer, the kind of cold gray dawn that turned breath into fog and dulled every sound. Staff Sergeant Mara Hale stood at parade rest outside the SEAL Team 7 compound. Desert tan boots set square on concrete, still slick from the night's drizzle. She was 28, 5'6", built compact and tight, more like coiled wire than raw mass. Her Army combat uniform was sharply pressed, sleeves rolled with regulation precision to mid-forearm, exposing old scars like rope burns, and a newer surgical line tracing her left wrist. Her dark hair was pulled into a strict bun, and her face showed nothing. No nerves, no hostility, just a calm, settled stillness that made people uneasy if they stared too long. She didn't shift her weight, she didn't glance at her watch, she waited. The gate in front of her was chain link topped with razor wire, and beyond it sat the low, squat buildings where some of the most dangerous men in the military trained and lived. A few of them passed by on their way to the chow hall, giving her the flat, measuring look combat veterans reserve for anything unfamiliar. No nods, no words. Eventually, Master Chief Petty Officer Nolan Pierce stepped out of the admin building. Broad-shouldered, mid-40s, graying high and tight, his face looked like it had been carved from hardwood. A clipboard hung in one hand, and he moved with the slow, deliberate stride of someone whose knees had absorbed too many hard landings. He stopped a few feet in front of her and scanned her from boots to bun, skepticism fully on display. For those watching from anywhere in the world, stay with this. This story runs deeper than it first appears. And if real stories about real people matter to you, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Pierce told her she was early. Hale answered calmly that she was on time. He repeated himself, louder this time, as if raising his voice might somehow rewrite reality. He went on to explain that she'd be sleeping in the transient barracks on the far side of base, not anywhere near the team spaces, and that her work hours would depend on training schedules she wouldn't see until each morning. He made sure she understood this was a short-term assignment through USSCOM's K-9 support detachment, that she was there strictly to assess operational readiness, and that if she caused friction or failed to produce results, she'd be gone within 48 hours. She said she understood. What he never asked, what none of them ever bothered to ask, was why a staff sergeant with 8 years of service would take a lateral move that quietly damaged a career, an assignment most handlers worked hard to avoid. No one asked about the faint tan line on her left shoulder either, the clear outline of a patch that didn't belong to any standard military police or Army MWD unit. And no one questioned why. When she signed the check-in roster, her handwriting came out precise and mechanical, the kind of controlled script used by someone trained to write operations reports under pressure. Master Chief Nolan Pierce handed her a key card, told her to report to the kennels at Zoo 700, then walked off without waiting for a response, already acting as if she'd been filed away and forgotten. Mara Hale was born in Fairbanks, Alaska, the daughter of a bush pilot and a mother who died from a cerebral aneurysm when Mara was 6. She grew up in a place where winter meant 40 below, and hesitation could get you killed. Her father, Daniel Hale, was a quiet man who had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat engineer, and he raised his daughter with a simple rule. The world didn't care about feelings, only competence. He taught her to fly a Cessna 172 before she was old enough to drive, showed her how to field dress a caribou, navigate by the stars when GPS failed, and fix an engine using nothing more than a Leatherman and patience. The lesson that stuck most came when she was 12, helping him train his lead sled dog, a Siberian husky named Boreal. He told her animals didn't lie, that people would smile and deceive you without hesitation, but a dog would always tell the truth through its eyes and its body, if you learned how to listen. That idea stayed with her. At 18, she enlisted in the Army, scored high enough on the ASVAB to choose her path, and selected military police with one clear goal: the Military Working Dog Program. She wanted dogs, not people. People disappointed her. Dogs never did. By 22, she was a certified MWD handler at Bagram Airfield, running explosives detection patrols with a Belgian Malinois named Atlas. That deployment changed everything. It was July 2019, late in the drawdown, but while special operations units were still running targeted missions, she was attached to ODA 700F, clearing villages in a contested area of Helmand Province. The mission felt routine until Atlas gave a hard alert on a doorway that looked clean. The team leader, Captain Rourke, ordered her to move past it. Atlas refused, bracing himself in the threshold. Rourke raised his voice, told her to control her dog. Mara held her ground and said the dog was never wrong. Rourke stepped around her, forced the door open, and triggered a pressure plate IED packed with 15 pounds of explosives, ball bearings, and rusted nails. The blast killed him instantly and wounded 2 other operators. Mara woke up 3 days later in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center with a shattered left wrist, rebuilt with a titanium plate and 7 screws, a severe concussion, and the news that Atlas had died from shrapnel wounds after shielding her body with his own. They awarded her a Bronze Star with a V device for staying in position under fire to treat casualties until medevac arrived. They rebuilt her wrist with hardware that ached every time the temperature dropped. They issued her a new dog and cleared her to redeploy after 6 months of physical therapy. What they couldn't repair was the cold anger that surfaced every time someone with rank and ego decided they knew more than a trained animal, or the weight of guilt that sat in her chest because Atlas had been right and she hadn't stopped a man from killing himself. After that deployment, she was quietly recruited into a joint program that didn't officially exist, an experimental special operations unit that embedded MWD teams directly into high-threat task forces where failure wasn't an option and nothing ever made it into a record. The training was classified and the missions were never talked about. For 3 years, Mara Hale worked in places that didn't exist on any official map, alongside operators whose names she was ordered to forget, carrying out work that would never appear in a service record. The tattoo on her left shoulder, hidden beneath her sleeve, was plain and deliberate. A black paw print with a single word beneath it in clean block letters, Atlas, and below that, in smaller text, K9 Jelly E7. She touched it now and then without thinking, the way some people reached for a medal or a charm. She left that program 6 months earlier for reasons no one asked about and she never offered. When SOCOM reached out about a temporary evaluation assignment at Port Reyes, she accepted not to prove anything, but because poorly trained dogs got operators killed, and she wasn't willing to watch that happen again. The SEAL Team 7 MWD facility sat tucked into a corner of the compound, heavy with the smell of disinfectant, damp concrete, and tension. Inside were 8 dogs, 6 Belgian Malinois and 2 German Shepherds, Each housed in individual chain-link runs with concrete floors and steel water bowls bolted to the fence. They were lean, hard animals, tracking Mara's approach with the tired, watchful focus of dogs that had been worked often, but not well. The senior handler was Petty Officer Second Class Evan Calder, 26, 6'3", 230 pounds, carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd always been the biggest person in the room and rarely challenged. His blonde hair ran a little long by regulation, and he leaned against the kennel gate with his arms crossed when Mara arrived at 0700. He told her the program was solid, said their operational tempo was strong, that the dogs had performed just fine during recent training evolutions. He made it clear the teams didn't need an Army handler auditing their work, and if she had concerns, she could put them in a report and he'd file it wherever reports like that ended up. Mara asked for the training logs and medical records. Calder said they were locked in the office and the kennel master had the key. She asked when the dogs had last seen a veterinarian. He said last month. She asked why the largest male, Malinois, Brutus, was favoring his right front leg when he walked. Calder waved it off, said the dog was fine, just getting old. Without asking permission, Mara stepped past him, opened Brutus's run, and knelt a few feet in front of the dog. Brutus dropped into a low growl, ears flattened, lips pulling back to show his canines. Mara didn't speak or move. She stayed exactly where she was, hands open and visible, breathing slow and steady. After 40 seconds, the growling stopped. 30 seconds later, Brutus stepped forward and sniffed her outstretched hand. She ran her fingers lightly down his right foreleg and felt the swelling immediately. Carpal joint inflammation consistent with repeated impact on hard surfaces without proper rest. She stood and told Calder the dog needed a veterinary evaluation within 24 hours and restricted duty until cleared. Calder snapped back that she didn't give orders in his kennel. By 1000, word had spread through the team spaces that the new evaluator was a woman, and that she'd walked straight into Calder's territory, accusing him of mishandling his dogs. By noon, 3 other SEALs had found excuses to wander past the kennels. One of them, Petty Officer First Class Blake, stopped and asked whether she'd actually deployed or just run drills on some stateside base. Mara said she'd deployed. He asked where. She answered, Bagram and Helmand. He pressed for the unit. She told him that wasn't releasable. Blake laughed and said everyone with a story claimed classified work, and if she couldn't hang with real door kickers, she should stick to walking bomb dogs along the wire. That afternoon, Calder set up an impromptu demonstration. He told Master Chief Nolan Pierce that if Mara wanted an evaluation, the team might as well show what the program could do. Around 1400, a dozen SEALs gathered near the vehicle bay. Calder ran Brutus through a vehicle-borne IED detection course. 8 vehicles with training aids hidden in wheel wells, undercarriages, and engine compartments. Brutus found 6 of 8 in 11 minutes. Calder stood at the end with his arms crossed, staring at Mara like he was daring her to say something. Mara asked if she could work one of the other dogs. Pierce agreed. She chose the smallest Malinois in the program, a 3-year-old female named Nix, flagged in the logs for aggression issues and a low alert rate. Mara spent 5 minutes alone with Nix in her run, giving no commands and offering no food rewards, just sitting with the dog and letting the silence do the work. She lowered herself onto the concrete, back against the chain link, and waited without a word. Nix paced for nearly 2 minutes before inching closer to sniff Mara's boots. Mara slowly raised one hand, palm open, letting the dog decide. When Nix stepped in, Mara brushed her fingers lightly along the dog's ribs and felt a sharp flinch on the right side. Pure pain response. Beneath the fur was scar tissue from an old injury that hadn't healed right. Someone had struck this dog hard enough to crack ribs. When Mara stood and moved toward the vehicle course, Nix followed immediately, no hesitation. They worked in near silence. Mara used only subtle hand cues and posture, no verbal commands at all, and Nix moved with a level of focus and confidence she hadn't shown 10 minutes earlier. Nix found all 8 training aids in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. On the final hide, a simulated device under the rear bumper of a Humvee, Mara knelt and pressed her forehead gently to the dog's head for 3 quiet seconds. No one watching said a word. Evan Calder's face flushed red, his jaw tight, but he stayed silent. Master Chief Nolan Pierce observed without comment, then turned and walked back toward the compound. That night, someone scrawled the word Hassan across Mara's transient barracks door in 2-inch paint marker letters. She cleaned it off with rubbing alcohol in a rag and never filed a report. At 20:30, she sat alone in her quarters with the lights off, her back against the wall. The room was 8 by 10 feet. Metal rack, wall locker, one small window facing the parking lot. She didn't bother turning on the overhead light. She'd lived in tighter spaces, in far worse places. Her wrist throbbed the way it always did when the marine layer rolled in, or when she pushed the joint past what the titanium would tolerate. She flexed her fingers slowly, feeling the plate shift beneath the scar, a constant reminder that her body was reinforced with hardware now, and that some limits couldn't be ignored anymore. She thought about Nix, about that flinch when her ribs were touched, fear buried so deep it had twisted into reactivity. She thought about how easily someone like Calder could have labeled that dog unfit and ordered her euthanized or sidelined forever. That was what happened to dogs who didn't perform. It was what happened to people, too, if they showed weakness in front of the wrong crowd. Her thoughts drifted to Atlas, to the way he'd braced himself in that doorway and refused to move, to Captain Rourke stepping forward with absolute certainty, to the blast, the smell of cordite and burned flesh, and the weight of Atlas's body across her chest when she came to in the rubble, his blood soaking into her uniform. Lying in a hospital bed in Landstuhl, arm in a cast and mind dulled by morphine, she'd made herself a promise. She would never let arrogance cost a dog its life again. She would train handlers who listened. She would fix broken systems even if it meant standing up to people who outranked her, outnumbered her, and wanted her gone. She was keeping that promise now. If Calder and his team wanted to try to break her for it, they were free to try. She'd been broken before. She knew what surviving that felt like, and she knew the only choice that mattered was whether you stayed down or got back up and finished what you started. Mara stood, laced her boots, and stepped out into the cold. She ran 6 miles through the base in the dark, breath fogging in the salty air, rebuilt wrist aching with every stride. When she returned, she took a cold shower, lay down fully dressed on the rack, and slept for 4 dreamless hours. At 06:30 the next morning, Evan Calder was waiting outside the kennels with 5 other SEALs, Master Chief Pierce standing 20 feet behind them. Calder told her the team had concerns about her ability to perform under pressure, and that a field training evolution had been scheduled to evaluate her in a realistic environment. The exercise would be held at the Naval Special Warfare Urban Training Facility, 2 miles inland from the compound. She was given 90 minutes to plan and execute a full building clearance using a dog of her choosing. The scenario included unknown explosive threats, shifting objectives under time pressure, and unpredictable changes to the tactical picture. If she failed to meet standards, the evaluation would end on the spot and she'd be removed from the assignment. Master Chief Nolan Pierce raised no objection and told her to be ready to move in 30 minutes. Mara Hale chose Nix. She spent 20 minutes reviewing the scenario brief, which was intentionally vague and riddled with contradictions. The target was a 3-story concrete structure modeled after urban buildings in Iraq and Afghanistan, with multiple entry points, internal stairwells, and more than 40 rooms. Intelligence reports warned of possible IEDs in unknown locations with unknown trigger systems. Role players would act as hostile or neutral civilians. Rules of engagement were deliberately unclear. The clock would start the moment she breached the front door. Mara loaded Nix into a transport van and drove to the site alone, while Evan, Calder, and the others followed in 2 separate vehicles. The building sat isolated in the middle of a dusty lot, ringed by dirt berms and empty observation towers, lifeless in the flat morning light with every window dark. Outside the van, Mara knelt beside Nix, checking her eyes, breathing, and posture. The dog was calm and locked in. Mara clipped a 6-foot tactical lead to Nix's working harness and walked toward the main entrance without glancing back at the observers. Inside, the air smelled of stale dust and old concrete. She moved with deliberate patience, letting Nix work slightly ahead on the lead, reading every shift in ears and posture. The dog flowed forward with precise, head-low scanning. At the second room off the main hallway, Nix froze and alerted hard, staring at a closed door. Mara marked it with tape and waited. Nix circled, then alerted again, stronger this time. Mara called it confirmed. Behind the door was a training IED replica, a pressure plate wired to a smoke charge. She cleared the entire first floor in 19 minutes without missing a single threat. The stairwell to the second floor was narrow and steep. Nix stopped at the base, ears flattening. Mara halted instantly. She scanned the steps and saw nothing obvious, but the dog's body language was absolute. Moving to the wall, she inspected the third step from the bottom with a small LED light and spotted a thin tripwire stretched across the riser at ankle height, nearly invisible in shadow. She marked it and continued upward. The second floor was a tight maze of interconnected rooms. Halfway through, a role player in civilian clothing stepped out from a doorway and began shouting in Dari, a language Mara recognized from deployment. He wasn't armed and didn't advance, but he blocked the corridor. Mara issued a verbal warning in English, waited 3 seconds, then edged past him along the opposite wall with Nix positioned cleanly between them. He stayed put. At the far end of the hallway, Nix refused to approach a closed metal door, alerting from 8 feet away, body rigid. Mara checked the hinges, frame, and handle. No visible wires, no devices. But when she knelt and placed her palm at the base of the door, she felt a faint vibration. She marked it as a possible command-detonated threat and bypassed the room entirely. 78 minutes into the evolution, a simulated explosion detonated on the first floor. Non-toxic theatrical smoke poured up through the stairwell. A loudspeaker announced a simulated casualty on the third floor requiring immediate extraction. It hadn't been in the scenario brief. This was Calder changing the conditions mid-exercise. Mara saw the choices clearly. Abandon methodical clearance and rush upward. Keep clearing and miss the casualty timeline, or find another way. She chose the third option. She finished clearing the second floor at her original pace, refusing to let a manufactured deadline force a mistake. Once the floor was confirmed clear, she moved to the third floor stairwell and sent Nix ahead to check for wires and pressure devices. The dog alerted twice. Mara marked both threats and continued upward. The casualty turned out to be a role player lying in a third-floor corridor, stage makeup convincingly simulating a traumatic lower leg amputation. She dropped to a knee beside him and ran a quick assessment. Airway clear, breathing steady, severe simulated hemorrhage from the left leg. She pulled a combat tourniquet from her blowout kit, cinched it high on the thigh until the bleeding stopped, marked the time on the casualty card, and called in a simulated medevac over her radio. Then she went back to work. She finished clearing the rest of the third floor without rushing. Nix found 2 more training devices, and Mara marked both. She exited the building at 1 hour and 46 minutes, Nix walking at her side, calm and under control. Evan Calder was waiting outside with his arms crossed and told her she'd missed the casualty extraction timeline by 9 minutes. Mara pointed out that the scenario brief made no mention of casualty operations, that adding unplanned medical objectives mid-evolution without notification violated NSW training safety protocols, and that her clearance had been executed to standard with 0 missed threats. Master Chief Nolan Pierce, who had been standing silently near the vehicles, told Calder to stop talking. Pierce then walked into the building himself with a clipboard to verify her markings. 23 minutes later, he came back out and confirmed she'd identified every training device in the structure, including 2 that weren't listed in the official scenario plan, devices Calder had placed without authorization or documentation. That evening, just after 1900, Calder made his last move. He cornered Mara outside the kennels and told her that if she wanted the team's respect, she needed to prove she could handle a working dog under real stress. Not in a controlled exercise, but in a situation where drive and aggression were fully engaged. He described a test they supposedly used for new handlers. Get locked into a pen with 3 high-drive patrol Malinois that hadn't been fed in 24 hours and demonstrate control without getting bitten. That, he said, was how they separated real handlers from people who just filled out paperwork. Mara asked if Master Chief Pierce had approved this evolution. Calder said it didn't matter what Pierce knew. At 1930, Calder and 5 other SEALs escorted Mara to a training enclosure behind the kennels. The pen was 20 by 20 feet. Chain link on all sides, bare concrete floor, no cover, no obstacles. Inside were 3 male Malinois, Brutus, Slate, and Fang, all patrol-trained apprehension dogs with documented bite histories. They'd been isolated since the night before with minimal food and limited water, a clear violation of military animal welfare regulations that could trigger court-martial if reported. They paced the fence line, keyed up, eyes hard, bodies tight, tracking the gate. Calder unlocked it and told Mara to step inside. She asked again if this was an official training event with documentation and safety oversight. He told her she could either enter the pen or pack her gear and leave Port Reyes that night. The other SEALs formed a loose semicircle. No one spoke. No one objected. Mara stepped through the gate. Calder slammed it shut behind her and clipped it with a carabiner. He said the test would last 5 minutes. Maintain control without injury and she passed, get bitten and she failed, try to climb out and she failed. He checked his watch and said the clock was running. Brutus moved first, 110 pounds of controlled violence sliding forward in a low stalk, ears pinned, hackles raised. Slate and Fang split wide, flanking from both sides, the pack coordinating exactly as they'd been trained to when engaging a threat. Mara stood in the center of the pen, hands loose at her sides, weight evenly balanced, breathing slow and steady. She avoided direct eye contact and made no sudden moves. She didn't challenge them or retreat. She simply occupied the space without presenting herself as a threat. Brutus stopped 8 feet away. A low growl rolled out of his chest, a sound filled with warning and calculation. Mara didn't react. Fang drifted out of her peripheral vision on the left, a sharp, probing movement meant to trigger instinct. She didn't flinch or turn. Her heart rate spiked, but stayed under control. Her rebuilt wrist throbbed, but her hands remained steady. Then, with slow intention, she began to lower herself. Every motion was deliberate. She settled onto one knee, turned her head slightly to the right, and exposed the side of her neck, the most vulnerable posture a human can offer an aggressive canine. In a dog's language, it wasn't submission born of fear, but absolute trust backed by understanding. She held the position for 5 seconds. Her pulse hammered, cold sweat sliding down her spine despite the evening air. She extended her right hand, palm up, fingers loose, and waited. Brutus stepped forward. He sniffed her hand, then her face, his nose cold and damp against her cheek. After a moment, he sat directly in front of her and leaned in until his forehead rested against her chest, a quiet signal of recognition and trust. Slate and Fang stopped circling. They approached more carefully, sniffed her hand, and within 40 seconds all 3 dogs were seated around her in a loose formation, calm, alert, not subdued or beaten, simply acknowledging someone who spoke their language fluently. Mara reached up and scratched Brutus gently behind his right ear, exactly where she'd felt tension in his muscles 2 days earlier. She rose, walked to the gate, and met Evan Calder's eyes through the chain link. She told him to open it. He didn't move. His face had drained of color. One of the SEALs, Chief Ramirez, demanded to know what he'd just witnessed. Calder muttered something about luck, maybe coincidence. Mara lifted her left hand, rolled back her sleeve, and pressed her shoulder close to the fence so they could see clearly under the security lights. The tattoo was unmistakable now, the black paw print, and beneath it, in smaller block letters, K9 Jelly 7. Ramirez stepped closer and stared for several seconds before looking back at her. He asked if she was the handler from Helmand Province, the one attached to ODA 7915 in 2019, the one whose dog had alerted on an IED that killed a captain and saved half a team from a secondary device. Mara said she was. Ramirez turned on Calder and told him he was a damn fool, then pulled out his phone and made a call. 8 minutes later, Master Chief Nolan Pierce arrived with Commander Lucas Harrow, the officer in charge of SEAL Team 7's MWD program. Harrow took one look at Mara, standing inside the pen with 3 patrol dogs lying calmly at her feet, and asked Pierce who had authorized this. Pierce pointed directly at Calder. Harrow told Calder he was relieved of all kennel duties effective immediately and would face captain's mast for unauthorized use of military working dogs in violation of federal animal welfare statutes and DoD regulations, along with potential charges for hazing and creating a hostile work environment. He then opened the gate, stepped into the pen, and extended his hand to Mara. He told her he'd reviewed her unredacted service file after Pierce's report from the morning's training evolution, and admitted he hadn't realized she was the handler from the Helmand incident, Operator Juliet 7, part of a program most of NS dollars didn't even know existed. Harrow said that if she was willing to stay at Port Reyes, he wanted her to take full operational control of the K9 program and rebuild it to real standards. His teams, he said, needed someone who understood that dogs weren't equipment, they were teammates, and if she could teach that, she'd have his full authority and support. Mara looked down at Brutus, still seated quietly beside her, touched the tattoo on her shoulder, then met Harrow's gaze and said she'd stay as long as it took to fix what was broken. 2 weeks later, Petty Officer 2nd Class Evan Calder was transferred to a support activity unit in San Diego with a punitive letter of reprimand permanently entered into his service record. He received non-judicial punishment, reduction to Petty Officer 3rd Class, forfeiture of half his pay for 2 months, and 45 days restriction to base. He didn't appeal and never spoke to Mara before leaving. Mara moved into a small office beside the kennel facility and began rebuilding the program, one broken system at a time. Mara rewrote the training SOPs from the ground up, aligning them with current SOCOM standards instead of outdated habit. She put mandatory veterinary checks on the calendar every 30 days and enforced rest protocols for any dog showing physical strain or behavioral stress. A veterinary behaviorist was brought in from Lackland Air Force Base to assess each dog individually. Brutus's carpal joint inflammation was treated with restricted duty and structured physical therapy, and 6 weeks later he was cleared back to full operational status. Nix, once flagged for possible removal due to so-called aggression issues, became the highest-performing explosives detection dog in the program within 40 days. Mara overhauled handler training as well, not with classrooms or written exams, but by requiring every handler to spend 1 full hour each day sitting in silence with their assigned dog, learning to read posture, breath, and intent without commands or rewards. Some of the SEALs pushed back at first. Others, like Chief Ramirez, understood immediately. Slowly, the culture began to change. One early December morning, a young petty officer, 3rd class, named Miles Cade, approached Mara outside the kennels, hesitant and unsure. He was 23, 9 months out of Bud-Ass, newly assigned to the K-9 program, despite asking for something else. He told her he didn't think he was cut out for dog handling, said he didn't understand how to communicate with the animals, admitted he was worried about failing and getting dropped from the team. Mara asked him if he'd ever been afraid of failing at anything before. He said yes. She asked if he'd quit. He said no. She told him that was the only answer that mattered. She handed him Nix's lead and told him to take her for a walk, not training, not rehearsal, just a walk where he focused on nothing except what the dog was telling him. 90 minutes later, he came back looking different. He asked if he could work with Nix again the next day. Mara told him he could work with her every day, as long as he committed to actually learning. That night, after the kennels were secured and the compound went quiet, Mara stood alone among the runs. The dogs were fed, settled, resting on clean bedding with fresh water. She moved slowly down the line, checking bowls, adjusting blankets, running her hand along the chain link. When she reached Brutus's run, she stopped. The big Malinois rose and pressed his head gently into her hand through the fence. She thought about Atlas, about the promise she'd made in a German hospital with her arm rebuilt from titanium and her future uncertain. About every dog she'd trained, lost, and saved over 8 years. About the handlers she was teaching to listen instead of just command. The weight was still there, and it always would be, but for the first time since Helmand it felt less like a burden and more like a purpose she had chosen for herself. She touched the tattoo on her shoulder, the one that would never fade, the one that reminded her every day why this work mattered. Then she shut off the overhead lights and stepped out into the cool California night, leaving the kennels quiet, steady, and safe behind her.